And I'm going to say something too, and if I'm wrong, Mr. Griffin, correct me. And to a lot of you African American pastors who are listening tonight, right now, according to our stat board, we have a little over 10.5 million listeners online from 125 countries. Dr. Martin Luther King said that he was never a communist, but if there is telltale information, evidence that he not only was a communist, but the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the NAACP, SNCC, the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, all of these organizations, CORE, had been subsidized and still is subsidized by the Communist Party. And again, Dr. King, to me, was a communist. And that's not a popular saying here in New York City, especially in the black community. But, you know, he went to a school in Tennessee, I believe, called the Highlander Folk School for Communist Training. Dr. King, it seemed like they packaged him, Dr. Griffin. It seems like they packaged Dr. King just like they did Barack Obama to put an African-American face to black America, and not just to black America, to America as a whole. And then with the oratory skills of these men, of Dr. King and Barack Obama, it seemed like a lot of African Americans were suckered into this communist plot. What say you, Manica?
Well, you're quite right in that it's a terribly sensitive issue because so much of the image that we have of Dr. King is so positive. I mean, gosh, he's an international hero. He's certainly a national hero. We have, highways and airports named after him and all that sort of thing. And on the surface, you can see, well, the civil rights movement, the elevation of political rights for black people, isn't that good? What are you talking about? Do you think that's bad? What are you, a hidden racist or something like that? But what we're talking about here is not the surface, but what's deep underneath it. And it is, first of all, what you said is documented. There are photographs. I imagine there's on the internet. Back in the day when I was reading this, I had to find the photographs and hard copy them of Martin Luther King as a young man sitting in the Highlander Folk School, I think it was, and other organizing groups that were clearly financed and dominated by the Communist Party. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody that went to these groups was a communist. Now, remember, I sat in some of those groups back in the 60s when I went and started to hang out at the Communist bookstore. They invited me into a study group. Well, if somebody had taken a picture, there I would be, you see. And that would be correct. And I would have to explain, I was there. I was learning about all of this. That didn't mean I was buying into it. So we have to be careful. It's because we know that Martin Luther King was there in a communist training group. Doesn't mean that he was a dedicated card-carrying member of the Communist Party. But we do know that he was subject to that influence, and he never spoke out against them. And we also know, now here's the critical thing. Regardless of what a man might feel in his heart, we have to judge by what he does, okay? He might be well-intentioned, but make some big mistakes. And we do know that the platform of the Communist Party at the very time that all this was going on, now I'm talking about the Communist Party USA platform, was to promote what they called civil rights legislation. Now, as we know, that most legislation has deceptive naming. If they're proposing a bill in Congress and they're going to call it the bill for let's say affordable health care. It's not going to be affordable.
Talk about that. No, not at all.
It's not going to be affordable. And that's just the way it is. No. The Federal Reserve Act, was proposed as a means of providing a Federal Reserve program of banking reserves. Well, it wasn't federal, didn't have any reserves. It was just the opposite of how it sounds. And so we have to understand that the civil rights bills, and there were several of them, that were being promoted by the Communist Party at that time, sounded good, but when you lifted off the label and looked underneath, what you saw was, the reality was, it was just a huge expansion of federal government power over all aspects of our lives. It was in the name of civil rights, but once you got rid of that word, civil rights, and saw what it was after everything. It greatly expanded the power and reach of the federal government. And that, of course, when you get a bigger and bigger and finally a total government, you have communism. And that is why, I mean, under a different name, but you still have the essence, you have a totalitarian system. And that's why the Communist Party at that time was advocating civil rights. They didn't care about civil rights or racial equality or fairness. All they wanted was power. Power. Lenin said it 1,000 times. Comrades, we must come to power. And we do whatever we must do to come to power. And then once we have the power, then we can reveal ourselves and we can smash our opposition with our clenched fist. And he spoke in terms like that. So we go back. What was all this about? The civil rights movement was about government power in the name of a very high-sounding and very worthwhile thing. But there was a big difference between the appearance and the reality.
Wow. And you know what blew my mind, Mr. Griffin? I'm so excited and very honored that you're on the broadcast tonight. I noticed in the documentary video, concerning the communism, their roots connected with the civil rights movement. I did not know that the terminology, "we shall overcome," was created by communists, or it's rooted in communism. And then the African American community picked up on that. Blew my mind. I probably watched this video probably 30 sometimes.
Oh my goodness!
In the last couple of weeks, because it was so powerful, and I want to thank God for you. Opened my eyes, and again, we have with us one of the most powerful men that I have ever.
States. By the winter, he was ready to go to New York City and settle in Harlem with his aunt, who was a school teacher. It was there where the Communist Party had begun to gain momentum and had a large presence. Rustin would flourish in New York and would enroll in New York City College, where he would take up singing once again. He joined the Josh White Quartet and was involved in a revival of John Henry on Broadway with Paul Robeson. He began singing at Cafe Society in Greenwich Village as a way of helping pay through college. He also joined the Young Communist League, who at the time was really dedicated to fighting against racial segregation in the U.S. Armed Forces. Congress passed the Selective Service Act in 1940 during peacetime, and Rustin, who was a strong pacifist and staunchly anti-war, had to register for the draft. He was able to get an exemption at a draft board as a conscientious objector, which meant that he had to do alternative service. When World War II began, the Young Communist Party shifted its focus, and this angered Rustin, and it caused him to leave the organization. Rustin then put all of his energy into supporting a March on Washington being organized by A. Philip Randolph, who was the leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. The march was to protest racial discrimination in the defense contracting industry and in the military. However, before the march happened, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which banned racial discrimination on the basis of race, creed, color, or nationality in the national defense industry. This didn't, however, reach Rustin's goal of a fully desegregated military, or all industries for that matter. Randolph decided to not move forward with the march, and this left Rustin disappointed yet again. He moved forward, but this wouldn't be the last time that he'd see Randolph. From there, he would join the Fellowship of Reconciliation, where he would meet one of his biggest mentors, Reverend A.J. Moost. FOR was an interfaith pacifist organization that believed in nonviolence, fellowship, and fought for economic justice. Moost was heavily influenced by the teachings of Gandhi and his ways of nonviolent protest. FOR formed CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, in 1942, and Rustin would travel across the country speaking and organizing nonviolent protests against racial inequality. This would get him a lot of unwanted attention, and eventually the draft board took notice. He was arrested on February 17, 1944, for failing to appear for alternative service, as he was required to as a conscientious objector. He went into a segregated prison in Ashland, Kentucky, where he was beaten by his white inmates for his pacifism and his open homosexuality. He was eventually transferred to a maximum security prison in Lewisburg, where he'd serve the rest of his sentence. While in prison, he wrote letters back and forth with one of his lovers, who had to disguise himself as a woman in their exchanges. When he was released in 1946, World War II was over and the civil rights era was in its infancy. At this point, he had a wealth of experience in nonviolent protest. He rejoined CORE and began planning the Journey of Reconciliation, a precursor to the Freedom Rides that protested the lack of enforcement of the Supreme Court ruling on Morgan v. Virginia that desegregated interstate buses in the South. The protests failed, and he ended up getting arrested once again and working on a chain gang in North Carolina. Rustin's activism pulled him in many directions, and in 1948, he was invited to travel to India to meet one of his idols, Gandhi. However, Gandhi would be assassinated before he had the opportunity to meet him. Still, he traveled to India to help fight for India's independence from Britain. Years later, he would also travel to Africa to assist Kwame Nkrumah in a similar goal of African self-rule. Through all of his work, Rustin was an openly gay man. This, however, wasn't something that the public was aware of. That was until 1953, when he was arrested in Pasadena, California, for having sex with two men in a parked car. Homosexuality was illegal in all states at the time. At this point, Rustin's homosexuality started to become a bit of a liability for the organizations that he worked for. Four terminated their relationship with Rustin when news of his arrest reached them. They felt that his actions could cast a negative shadow on the organization. He reconnected with Randolph, who was then able to get him a job at the War Resistance League, a pacifist organization where Rustin would work for the next 12 years. The next few years, Rustin would keep somewhat of a low profile, but Rosa Parks' Act of Defiance in 1955 would result in the rise of Martin Luther King's profile as a leader of the civil rights movement. King had begun organizing the Montgomery bus boycott in response to Parks' arrest. Randolph suggested that Rustin travel to Alabama to support King's actions. At this point, Rustin was a 44-year-old seasoned activist, and Martin Luther King was 25 years old and inexperienced with nonviolent protest. That didn't prevent some people from being skeptical of his involvement with the boycott. After all, he was a gay man, which was extremely taboo at the time, and a draft dodger. When it came to respectability, he stood in stark contrast to Martin Luther King, who embodied in the eyes of many white people a respectable Negro. However, King took Rustin on, and his pacifism influenced King, who disposed of his armed guards under his advisement. The boycott ended with success in 1956, when the Supreme Court desegregated the bus system. Civil rights organizers quickly began mobilizing to fight for full desegregation of the South. Rustin used his connections with radicals and pacifists in the North to help fund much of King's speeches and journalism. He helped fund and organize the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which would be very central to the civil rights movement. Rustin began to loathe white leadership in civil rights organizations. He believed that the people that should be at the helm of the movement were black Southerners who were the subject. However, Rustin himself was from the North, and in some situations, this placed him at odds with certain black Southern organizers. Rustin and King's relationship would be challenged when Adam Clayton Powell Jr. threatened to tell the press that King and Rustin were in a gay relationship. This was in protest to King's 1960 plans to march outside of the Democratic National Convention. King would distance himself from Rustin and cancel the march. In retaliation, Rustin then left the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Into the 60s, Rustin divided his time between international pacifist activism and racial justice efforts in the States. Though he'd always been an advocate of nonviolent direct action, Rustin began to question whether or not nonviolent direct action alone was the best way of accomplishing his goals of racial equality and democracy. In 1963, Randolph and Rustin were planning a march on Washington for economic justice. But in May, police in Birmingham, Alabama turned fire hoses and attack dogs on black children. And this shook America. King hadn't shown much interest in the march until this point. The focus of the march shifted when King decided to jump in and insist that the march be for civil rights. So the march became the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Rustin began to petition the Big Six civil rights organizations: SNCC, CORE, SCLC, the National Urban League, and the NAACP. He would then meet resistance from the last one when Roy Wilkins once again brought up Rustin's past as a gay communist draft dodger. Wilkins didn't want Rustin to be the front man for the march, as once again he was considered a liability. The resistance led to Randolph having to serve as the march's director and Rustin as his deputy. Planning moved forward. They began to plan the exact amount of bathrooms, doctors, and accommodations for an expected 2,500,000 people. However, they'd hit a bump in the road once again when Strom Thurmond, a South Carolina senator and segregationalist, got a hold of Rustin's FBI file. The FBI had been tracking Rustin's activity since college. Thurmond took to the Senate floor to attack Rustin personally for his connection to communism and his sexuality. This still didn't make Rustin back down, though. The March on Washington was seething with respectability. Speeches had to be approved, and several more radical speeches were cut entirely from the programming. Some of the speeches had to be edited down to be less aggressive. Most notably, John Lewis's militaristic speech was a topic of debate up to the day of the march. Rustin put together a list of 10 demands for the march and distributed pamphlets to bus drivers that were coming from all across the country to Washington. At first, it seemed like the march was a bit of a bust, but as people piled in, it became clear that the march was going to be a success. Everything went off with a hitch, and after King's speech, he took to the stage to make the goals of the march known.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first demand is that we have effective civil rights legislation, no compromise, no filibuster, and that it includes public accommodation, decent housing, integrated education, FAPC, and the right to vote. What do you say?
In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed and it outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or nationality. It also ended racial segregation in schools and public accommodations. The March on Washington was a landmark for the Civil Rights era, but it would also put an end to Rustin's personal belief in protesting alone being successful. He started to feel that the way to move forward was with a combination of protest and policy. After the march, he and Randolph formed the Philip A. Randolph Institute in 1964, which married civil rights issues to the issues of trade unions. Rustin would collaborate more and more with the Democratic Party, and as he got closer to them, members of the Black Power movement started to come out against him. Anti-war advocates started to become disappointed with him when he didn't immediately come out against the Vietnam War, and even for discouraging King from speaking about it as well. The movement that he was so instrumental in started to become disenchanted with him. Rustin was a man who ultimately believed in negotiation. He was, after all, a man of numerous identities and experiences and didn't feel that his activism was confined to him simply being a black man. In the 1980s, he opened up publicly about his sexuality and began focusing on the rights of gays and lesbians. He would meet Walter Nagel in Times Square one day, and he would be his partner for the next 10 years. Rustin died on August 24, 1987, of a perforated appendix a few days before the 24th anniversary of the March on Washington.
So in the 60s, after Manning Johnson passed away, there was two domestic terrorist groups that rose. They were white groups. One was female and one was all gender. So the first group was the Weather Underground, a domestic terrorist group in the 60s. The other group was M19. One of the leaders of the Weather Underground is a man named Eric Mann. Patrisse Cullors says in an interview that Eric Mann was her mentor. She says that he created the organization called the Labor Community Strategy Center, which sounds very much like the type of organizations Manning Johnson lists in his book. She says it was her first political home, and basically that Eric Mann was her mentor. So when she was trained in being an organizer and a Marxist, she was trained by Eric Mann, one of the leaders of the domestic terrorist group, the Weathermen, a communist organization. All right. That's one connection to Black Lives Matter being backed or their elders being white communists.
But you must look beyond what you think race is. You must look beyond what you think black is to connect these dots.
All right, so when you want to donate to Black Lives Matter, you have to donate through a company called, or organization called Thousand Currents. Thousand Currents is the fundraising and fiscal sponsor for the Black Lives Matter global movement. The woman who was, she served as vice chair of the board of directors for Thousand Currents, was an active member of revolutionary left-wing movements whose illegal activities included bombing U.S. government buildings and committing armed robberies. So the person who sits on the board of the fundraising and fiscal sponsorship for Black Lives Matter was also a convicted domestic terrorist. And then the mentor of one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter was also a convicted domestic terrorist. They were all white communists. These are the people behind Black Lives Matter. So when you wonder why they move the way that they move, it's very simple. Just like Manning Johnson.
Black Lives Matter Global Network is not for black people at all. It's never been. So when they come out and say that they're only going to focus on black lives being taken by white police officers, that tells me everything. Because how can a black life matter if it doesn't matter, period?
In 2015, Black Lives Matter held an event in Harlem where they invited the dictator of Venezuela, the communist nation Venezuela. They invited him to be honored in America in 2015.
So I want to just first off say thank you to the government of Venezuela and President Maduro. I really appreciate your participation in this event and your leadership.
The same year, a 14-year-old was killed during a protest in his country by the police. So during that time, the people were protesting this guy and they were being killed in the streets. But this is a time when the leaders of Black Lives Matter, an organization against police brutality, invites this man to the country to be honored. They call him a comrade. They consider him a brother and a friend.
See, the whole premise behind Black Lives Matter is a false one anyway, because it's really a plea to the power structure to say, please stop killing us. My only issue with that is I don't believe you can actually beg the people that are oppressing you, beg them for you to exist. Like, I'm not asking anybody for my right to exist. I'm not. So I don't even have to make the statement that Black Lives Matter, because I know that my life matters, period. Now, you all can throw black in front of it. Anytime you see black in front of something, it's owned by the white power structure. Anytime you see black in front of something, it's owned by the white power structure. There's no such thing as black leadership, because black leadership has to be endorsed by the white power structure. So everybody you see that's in a position of power, that's black in leadership, they've been placed there by the white power structure.
And more than that, I would say that just because a person is a Negro or a black American does not mean that he's going to struggle for Negro rights or for jobs for Negroes or anything else. I think that today you could point to a large number of Negro leaders who have consistently betrayed Negroes in a whole host of areas.
They aren't really Negro leaders. These are puppets that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. These are parrots that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. You can't name me a Negro leader who has been betrayed Negroes, who has not been endorsed, sanctioned, subsidized, and supported by the white liberals.
The book even explains how black leaders looking to climb the ladder of success a little faster were used as frontmen to bait the black population to be led astray. In return for money and preferred treatment, these men became what Manning refers to as race leaders. And as the race leaders rose, the book continues to explain how white leftists descended on Negro communities like locusts, posing as friends come to help liberate their black brothers.
I think there are many whites who act friendly toward Negroes. A fox acts friendly toward the lamb. And usually the fox is the one who ends up with the lamb chop on his plate. The wolf doesn't act friendly, and therefore the wolf has more difficulty in getting the lamb chop in his plate.
I'd like to point out, though, that...
And I say that because it is usually if you study the structure of the Negro community, economically, politically, civically, psychologically, and otherwise, it's controlled by the white liberal, who usually poses as the friend of the Negro, who actually differs from the white conservative in the same way that the fox differs from the wolf. Their appetite is the same. Their motives are the same. It's only their mannerisms and methods that differ.
There
are many whites who are trying to solve the problem, but you never see them going under the label of liberals. That white person that you see calling himself a liberal is the most dangerous thing in the entire Western Hemisphere. He's the most deceitful. He's like a fox, and a fox is always more dangerous in the forest than the wolf. You can see the wolf coming. You know what he's up to, but the fox will fool you. He comes at you with his mouth shaped in such a way that even though you see his teeth, you think he's smiling. You take